In Great Britain, we have a long-standing pugilist tradition. Whether it's a matter of honour or you're simply wearing the wrong t-shirt in Glasgow, it is a sacred, time-honoured right to settle disputes out on the cobbles. No prancing about with swords or hiding behind pistols, just you and your fists settling your beef like a man. And in the mean streets of the East End of London, there are a lot of disputes, which has bred many seasoned fighters that test their mettle and seek glory in the underground fisticuff circuit. But being underground away from those pesky regulators means that colourful characters from the gangster world often crop up and offer some lucrative side hustles to the champs. And today's mad lad is no exception. But no matter how tough you are, you can't be the top dog forever. And when you've built up a reputation as a terrifying fighter and enforcer, it's very hard to do anything else. So, what do you do instead? Well, you just get in front of a camera and pretend to do it. And if all of that sounds like a far-fetched plot of a Guy Ritchie movie, I suppose that's because, in a way, it kind of is. The hardest man in Britain, Lenny McLean, better known as the Guvnor. Please leave a like and a comment on this video because it really helps me in the algorithm. But before we get started, this video is sponsored by Atlas VPN. Get the greatest VPN deal on the market and enjoy the most affordable online protection for just $1.70 per month. Enjoy blazing speeds and stream your favourite show or step up your gaming experience at a lightning fast speed. Protect as many of your devices as you need with just a single subscription. I enjoy using Atlas VPN because it is seamless, fast and easy to use. No one should have to deal with corporations, governments or hackers spying on them and trying to steal their data. And Atlas VPN gives you a way to avoid that. I use Atlas VPN to watch shows on the American Netflix because, very annoyingly, they have much better content than the British one. You can stop ads and malware because the VPN blocks all connections to malicious links, ads and trackers, and it notifies you when someone is trying to steal your data. Save some money while shopping online and get the best deals while getting the most out of your online subscriptions, such as Netflix, Spotify, airlines, hotels and more. And right now, Atlas VPN is running a massive Black Friday discount. You can get a 3-year subscription for just $1.70 a month, plus 6 months free, and with a 30-day money-back guarantee. Time is running out, so get your deal in the description box down below. Show them some love. Click the link. Leonard John McLean was born on the 9th of April 1949 into some of the worst circumstances that you can imagine. The monumentally shitty hand that life had dealt the young Lenny consisted of his dad dying when he was only 4 years old, growing up in one of the poorest areas of East London, and having an absolute fucking monster of a stepdad. A man named Jim Irwin, who was a drinker and petty criminal that made life hell for Lenny and his 4 siblings, subjecting them to a childhood of psychological torment and absolutely brutal beatings, usually with his fists, but he'd often also throw a belt in there for good measure. And when I say brutal, I mean brutal. As Lenny himself put it, and I quote, "He broke my legs when I was 5 and broke my jaw when I was 6. When I was 7, he broke all of my ribs. He bashed me right about until I was 12. The abuse was so bad that Jim actually almost killed Lenny's brother, which caused Lenny's great-uncle Jimmy to step in and put a stop to it by beating the ever-loving shit out of Jim and then threatening to kill him if the abuse continued. Jim was quickly out of the picture after this incident, but sadly, the damage had already been done. Thanks to the horror of his childhood, violence was all Lenny knew, and it would haunt him for the rest of his life. Even though he had stopped the abuse, great-uncle Jimmy was no saint by any means. However, he was the closest thing that Lenny had to a positive influence, and the impressionable young boy wanted to be tough just like him, which led to Lenny beating the shit out of bullies from a very early age. Unfortunately, Jimmy's influence on Lenny just wasn't what he really needed. So, you can understand why things didn't get much better with Jim gone, and why Lenny soon began to engage in fatherless behaviour. At the age of 15, Lenny made a promising start by getting his first job on a construction site. But then he promptly lost the job after beating the shit out of his foreman. Then he fell in with the local gangsters and he ended up serving 18 months in jail for petty crimes before being released from jail while he was still in his teens. But as he entered his 20s, things started to look up for Lenny because he married his wife, Valerie. But because catching a break just wasn't on the cards for Lenny, his mother died when he was 21, which caused him to start drinking heavily. Now, grief and alcohol are already a recipe for misery. But when you add a temper like Lenny's and a lifetime's worth of bottled up rage, well, that's a recipe for disaster. Lenny ended up having a bit of a phase where he would go from pub to pub, getting in a lot of fights, until the powder keg blew and he ended up very, very narrowly avoiding prison. What started as an argument between Lenny and a guy named Jimmy Briggs over a girl, of all things, escalated into a fight, as Lenny was wont to do at this point. Except this time, Lenny went a little bit too far. Lenny actually beat the guy so hard that he broke both of his hands against the poor bastard's face. And as if that wasn't overkill already, Lenny bit into Briggs's windpipe. Briggs desperately needed surgery, and very, very fortunately for both him and Lenny, he managed to pull through. Also, as an ex-bouncer, 9 out of 10 fights that I broke up were caused by a woman. The near miss with a murder charge ended up being the wake-up call that Lenny needed, and he decided to ditch the bottle and start throwing his weight around in a more productive way. And he had a lot of fucking weight to throw around, which made him perfect for working security in the pubs of East London. Lenny used the bar fights to stop the bar fights. In addition to his work as a bouncer, Lenny decided to get into boxing at the age of 26. However, his criminal record prevented him from getting a boxing license. So, what did he do? He did the exact same thing that everybody else does when pesky government regulations get in the way. He went underground and did it anyway. Lenny became a fixture in the unlicensed bare-knuckle boxing circuit. At a height of 6'3" and weighing over 20 stone, he was practically designed to deal out punishment at the level that such a scene expects. But while Lenny had brawn to spare, he also had the brains, because that's where he kept all of his anger bottled up, ready to unleash on any would-be hardman that thought they could mess with him. Lenny knew how important it was to really be in the right mood for a fight, and he got into that headspace by concentrating on hating his opponent as much as possible to really get his blood boiling.
One on you.
Also, now before the fight, I go, I hate him. I hate him. Why do you hate him? He just interfered with my wife, he interfered with my kids.
Right. Right.
Take your head right off, smash everything from here, smash everything.
With his head in the game and his fists deep in his opponent's faces, Lenny spent the 70s and 80s kicking absolute arse in underground matches. And he quickly became known as 10 Men Len, because that's how many men it took to bring him down. While Lenny was an absolute machine in the ring, he wasn't unbeatable. 2 years into his career, in May of 1977, Lenny lost a fight to an absolute psycho named Roy Pretty Boy Shaw, who, like Lenny, was gypped out of a legit boxing career because of his criminal record. But in Shaw's case, the prison time was for armed robbery. However, this defeat didn't put Lenny off, which started an intense rivalry between the two fighters, especially since Lenny insists that he only lost because his gloves had been tampered with. One of the angriest men in the world is a sore loser. How shocking. However, as luck would have it though, Lenny's second cousin happened to be a boxing promoter by the name of Frank Warren, and he arranged a rematch for the following April with heightened stakes. Not only were the rivals fighting in front of a 2,000 strong crowd, but Pretty Boy Shaw had also made a £10,000 bet that he wouldn't be knocked out of the ring. In the business, we call this foreshadowing because Lenny won the fight in the first round by literally knocking Shaw out of the ring, evening the score and costing Shaw his £10,000. But Lenny didn't rest on his laurels. He knew how tough Shaw was, and he really put the work in to make sure that he would take the best of three in another rematch in September of 1978. He trained under a coach so that he could get fitter and box properly instead of just going goblin mode and solely relying on his size and rage. And it paid off. Lenny ended the fight in the first round with a spectacular flurry of punches before triumphantly declaring his new title. Lenny's 2 wins ended up being the only losses on Shaw's record. And from that point onwards, Lenny was the Guvnor. Lenny's ferocity in the ring made him one of the biggest names in bare-knuckle boxing. And it really is quite a thing to behold. He's been described as, and I quote, like a dog. He either gets bitten, rolls over and dies, or he'll come back and bite you. And good fucking lord did he bite. In 1986, Lenny took on the undefeated Mad Gypsy Bradshaw. But while he was tough, he was no Brad Pitt from Snatch. As the two fighters touched gloves, he headbutted Lenny right in the face. Lenny staggered for just a second because he'd been caught off guard, but he did not let such unsportsmanlike behaviour go unpunished. Bradshaw fucked around, and now it was time for him to find out. But you don't want me describing it to you, so here is the clip, which is absolutely glorious. The absolute demolition of Gypsy Bradshaw ended up revealing a hidden side to Lenny. While it was one of the best shows of his savage ferocity, it also proved to be a surprising demonstration of his underlying kindness. The beating had actually put Bradshaw into a coma, and according to Lenny's daughter, Lenny was very upset when he saw Bradshaw in the hospital. So he continued to visit him, which led to a friendship forming between the two fighters. After all, Bradshaw's headbutt might have been a dick move, but that was settled in the ring. There was no need to let any bad blood fester. By this point, Lenny was the king of the cobbles, and he began to look further afield to expand his kingdom, issuing a £20,000 challenge in the United States, and the crown that Lenny sought rested on the head of the King of the Bouncers. Mr. T. Lenny McLean wanted to fight Mr. T. And what a match that would have been. Imagine Lenny McLean fighting Clubber Lang himself. It's just a shame that Mr. T said no. Like a bitch, Lenny ended up flying across the pond anyway, heading to New York to take on their champion, the 6'8", 24-stone Big John McCormick. Lenny then went home victorious with a big purse and 2 broken hands because of how badly he fucked the guy up. Allegedly, Lenny also called out Muhammad Ali while he was at it, but if he did, the challenge went unanswered. Probably because Ali's later career had left him a bit shaken. Sorry. Due to the glory that he had accumulated in the ring, Lenny was unofficially recognised as the Underground World Heavyweight Champion, which ended up being a little bit of a double-edged sword. While this clout made it very clear that Lenny was not to be fucked with, it also drew the intense ire of those that he embarrassed the most in the ring. On one occasion, Lenny's wife opened the door to a guy that shot at Lenny 4 times while he was coming down the stairs. Fortunately, every shot missed and the gunman wisely hauled arse out of there before Lenny could get him. However, this wasn't the only occasion that Lenny was attacked at his home. The shooter didn't miss the second time and put a round right through Lenny's shoulder while he was locking his car. Luckily, it was just a flesh wound that went clean through, so Lenny didn't even have to go to the hospital. Eventually, the attacker's identity was revealed, which actually shocked Lenny because it turned out it was just some low-life junkie that Lenny had beaten in a previous match. Lenny was only surprised by this because he expected a hit to come from one of his many, many more powerful rivals. Lenny retired from the old fisticuffs in 1986 after allegedly taking part in over 3,000 fights, which is a hell of a lot. Probably too many. Unfortunately, that number is most likely inaccurate. Even Lenny's boxing promoter cousin, who you'd think would talk him up a bit, insisted that he'd actually only had about 15 fights, of which he lost 5. He also had a few choice words about Lenny being a massive bully that weren't too unwarranted, to be honest. In addition to overdoing it a bit with the boasting, Lenny also seemed like a bit of a sore loser, as he allegedly tried to hunt down, buy up and destroy all copies of one fight that cost him a title in 1979. But regardless of his actual record in the ring, Lenny claims to have never lost a fight where it counted. Out in the streets. So the 3,000 fight figure might be inflated by scraps that he had outside of the ring.
No, not street fighting.
Sometimes.
Never.
Just
see, I'm too quick, too mad, and too aggressive. Listen, never. I've never lost a fight on a cobbles.
No, you haven't lost.
However, the fact that Lenny was no longer boxing didn't mean that the calcification of his knuckles was slowing down anytime soon. He continued his work as a bouncer, often working at London's Hippodrome and Camden Palace, where he was so prolific and feared that he ended up becoming the de facto king of the bouncers in London. While this clout surely stopped a lot of would-be troublemakers from fucking with him, Lenny couldn't just rest on his prestige as the local punters really made him work. Lenny regularly faced off against idiots with knives, and he was even shot in a drive-by carried out by a hitman on a motorbike with a shotgun. Despite having been hit in the leg, the absolute unit actually tried to chase the gunman down before getting into a taxi to the hospital, where he just casually strolled into A&E with shotgun pellets in his leg. Of course, you don't spend so much time in London's criminal underworld without crossing paths with some of the heavy hitters. Not that they actually hit as hard as Lenny, but you know what I mean. Lenny got into debt collecting for the Kray twins, and he even became friendly enough with them that he appeared at Ronnie Kray's funeral. He was actually a prominent guest, although that position was likely to discourage any of the Kray's detractors from trying anything funny.
Big men in suits, the heavy mob, keeping a high profile at today's funeral, there to guard Kray's coffin. One of them admitting, "We're worried. There are a lot of people out there who don't like the Krays."
Despite being pals with the country's biggest mobsters, they weren't actually the cause of Lenny's next brush with the law. While working in security, Lenny was accused of the murder of a guy named Gary Humphreys in the early 90s, whom he had kicked out of the Hippodrome Club in Leicester Square for fighting with the DJs, dancing naked, and pissing on the floor. Unfortunately, before he did so, Lenny had taken Humphreys to a side room and broke his jaw. So it wasn't a good look when Humphreys turned up dead. Also, taking people into the side room, that doesn't actually happen. But it turned out that Humphreys was actually mentally ill and having a manic episode, so it quickly became clear what the actual cause of death was. The cops found him. Yeah, Humphreys' chicanery continued out in the streets after he was kicked out of the club. The police restrained him, and then, just like that, he died. And we've just recently made a video on this phenomenon called Excited Delirium, where people just magically keep dying while in police custody. However, the point of all that is this was enough to clear Lenny's name. But he didn't get off scot-free because the judge was not impressed by the fact that Lenny broke Humphrey's jaw to teach him a lesson before kicking him out of the club. So Lenny was sentenced to 18 months in prison for grievous bodily harm. In addition to working as a bouncer, Lenny did a load of other work on the side. Quite famously, he was a bodyguard for a number of celebrities, including Boy George, Freddie Starr, and the cast of The Bill, which gave him some industry connections that would go on to be very useful later on. However, not every side hustle depended on Lenny's ability to hurt people. He was also in the business of selling knockoff stuff, which led to his house often being full of just absolute garbage that Lenny couldn't sell, like glasses that he couldn't see through or cereal that tasted like cardboard. At one point, he also bought a newsagent's where a customer once accused Lenny of shortchanging him by a penny. Now, that doesn't sound like a big deal. After all, shit happens and we all make mistakes. I'm sure that the customer wasn't too bothered about it. However, the accusation angered Lenny so much that he threw the towel at the guy's head. Old habits clearly die hard. But despite violence being Lenny's whole life for very many years, he eventually managed to get to the point where it was merely just a job, with his motto on the doors being, "Treat kindness with kindness, but treat violence with violence." In other words, Sivi Pace Parabellum. Lenny was actually a doting family man who went to great pains and great lengths to keep that violence away from his children. But the spoils of that violence were all for them. According to his daughter, Kelly, Lenny would come home from boxing matches with his prize money and then chuck it in the air like confetti. As Lenny's wife Valerie put it, "He was so different from his image and was devoted to the kids and me. We were a little separate world that he kept away from all the violence and fighting. When Jamie was little, Lenny used to look at him and say, 'Son, you're never going to turn out like me. I'll make sure of that.' And I'm so proud of him for that." Despite his horrific upbringing, Lenny's family brought out the best in him and proved that he was capable of great love and kindness, not just for his family, but also his community. Lenny was a little bit of a local hero, and he would use his powers of great violence for good when necessary. However, this positive channeling of Lenny's darker impulses doesn't mean that handling his temperament was always easy. Neither Kelly nor Lenny's son Jamie had any illusions about who their dad was or what he was capable of. In fact, they had to keep him at arm's length sometimes because he protected them a little bit too well. After all, they couldn't tell Lenny if they were getting bother from anyone because his default mode of solving such problems was similar to that of a wrecking ball. Unfortunately, this volatility meant that Kelly's feelings about Lenny were very complicated for a very tragic reason. When she was a child, she was sexually abused by a female teenage neighbour and felt like she had to keep that trauma to herself because she knew that if she said anything, then Lenny would murder the girl's father and spend the rest of his life in prison. The duality of Lenny's nature led to a very love-hate relationship on Kelly's part because one moment he would be Father of the Year buying her 30 Easter eggs and the next she would be chewing too loudly. This would anger Lenny, who would fly into a rage that would cause Kelly to very often see him as a bully. Unfortunately, it actually got to the point where the two would argue a lot because Kelly was afraid of her dad. In contrast though, Jamie had a very different view of Lenny. For one, he really appreciated the fact that he and his mates would never ever have to queue for a club in London, and he generally looked up to him a lot more than Kelly did, saying, and I quote, "He was gentle and funny to us and his friends, never raising a finger to my sister and me. What my dad did in work and on the streets was bully bullies. Unprovoked violence only ever came as a vigilante, clattering blokes on the estate who'd hit their wives or kids. Sometimes even working with the police to sort out problems they couldn't get near. People respected him in the area and still do. That was the old code of honour." Even though Jamie held his father in high regard and understood that Lenny's might was more of a curse than a gift, he couldn't resist flexing with a bit of the old, "my dad could batter your dad." He insists that despite his size, Lenny was very, very quick with his hands and he could have done very well in the UFC. So well, in fact, that Jamie reckons that his dad, Lenny McLean, could have beaten Conor McGregor. But considering McGregor's size compared to Lenny's, well, yeah, no shit. I mean, don't get me wrong, I would absolutely love to see that fight, but the conclusion is a pretty obvious one. According to Jamie, Lenny even claimed to be faster than Bruce Lee. But that part I'm not too convinced of. As Lenny left the violent and tumultuous 80s behind him, the 90s proved to be a major turning point in Lenny's life as everything changed for the better. Through his work as a bodyguard, it became apparent that it wasn't just his martial prowess and physicality that made him respected. He also had a lot of charisma, and despite his thuggish reputation, everyone just really liked him. So Lenny ended up getting into acting while looking after the EastEnders cast and other showbiz friends who hooked him up with an agent. And he turned out to be really good at it. Lenny was impressive enough in front of the camera that he was actually asked what drama school he went to which he replied, "I've been shot twice, stabbed 100 times, and had 10,000 barroom brawls. Is that enough drama for you?" Yeah, it turns out that Lenny got his education from the School of Hard Knocks, but he put it to good use in a recurring role on ITV's The Knock, a small part in The Fifth Element. He's in there, you really need to be looking for him though, and a number of other small roles and bit parts, including an uncredited cameo in a 1990 biopic titled The Craze. But while Lenny was doing well for himself in a career that he was really enjoying, it was about to get even better. And to really make it in showbiz, all he needed was to know the right guy. This one in particular. Yes, Lenny's big break came when Guy Ritchie cast him in the severely underrated Lock, Stock and Two Smoking Barrels. And unfortunately, apart from Snatch, Guy Ritchie hasn't really made anything that good since. I mean, The Gentleman was alright, but Jesus, Hugh Grant carried the fuck out of that. But anyway, despite being cast as a pretty important character in the form of the villain's enforcer, Barry the Baptist, Lenny didn't really prepare for the role in the traditional sense. According to his daughter, Lenny never read the script, and he just made his own words up. He took the R. Lee Emery approach and ended up being the best part of the movie, absolutely stealing the funniest scene. Lenny drew from his experience in the employ of some of London's more ungentlemanly businessmen and really made the role of Barry the Baptist his own, which added a great sense of realism in addition to the fact that Lenny was just really naturally funny.
I suggest you get those guns. Quick! All right. And get us ice cream while you're at it.
The fact that a lot of Lenny's lines in Lock, Stock were reportedly improvised makes his comedic timing even more impressive, which left a real impression on Guy Ritchie. In fact, everyone on set seemed to really like him. Some of the actors even already knew him from his time as a bouncer. And of course, they all had stories about him and his time on the doors.
I worked with a guy once who got his jaw broken by Lenny McLean. When Lenny was a doorman at the Camden Palace, and this bloke was just drunk, fell through an emergency door. Next thing, he's just picking himself up off his feet. Next thing, he's got Lenny looming over him and just hits him once and broke his jaw in 4 places.
I knew Lenny McLean from the Camden Palace, because when I used to go to the Camden Palace as a kid, you know, Lenny used to be on the door. And for some funny reason, whenever I turned up with my friends, he always used to, I used to look at him, we used to go, all right, Lenny, how you doing? He'd go, go on, kid. We didn't have to play, go on, kid. And we used to just look, it used to be like punching a ticket, say, all right, Lenny, how you doing? He just used to remember it, go on, kid.
Lenny clearly had a ton of potential as a character actor, which was so great that Guy Ritchie actually had other projects lined up for him. But sadly, it was never meant to be. Lenny found himself coming down with what he thought was the flu, but then the doctor gave it to him straight. It was terminal lung cancer. And because he'd gone all in on the old ultraviolence in his early life, there wasn't really much point in trying to break bad. So instead, Lenny was just a bit of a troll about the whole thing, talking about his funeral all the time and relishing in people's reactions when he told them the bad news. Like, he found their reactions funny. Guy Ritchie was devastated when he found out, but he visited Lenny and his family often, joining him in his good humour by frequently quipping, whatever you do, don't die before we make the next movie. But this sentiment never got to be anything more than a good-natured joke between friends, because Lenny's cancer battle, sadly, ended in a draw on the 28th of July 1998, at the age of just 49. Leading up to the release of Lock, Stock and Two Smoking Barrels a month later, Guy Ritchie honoured Lenny by having the movie's marketing material altered to make Lenny more prominent, and the movie itself was dedicated to him. Around the same time, his autobiography titled The Guvnor was published, and it became an instant bestseller, giving the world an inside glimpse beyond the thuggish persona of an ultimately pretty complex guy. In the years after Lenny's death, it was revealed that he was probably bipolar and suffered from OCD as a result of his traumatic upbringing, which explains his vicious cycle of flying into rages. This also means that Lenny likely used violence as both a smokescreen and a coping mechanism to cover up just how much he was hurting for his entire life. Kelly later said that he always looked like he had the world on his shoulders, and that she didn't think that he actually enjoyed life. The revelation of Lenny's mental health issues put a lot into perspective for Kelly, who understandably had a very rough time in the wake of Lenny's death, having realised too late that all he needed was help, which she would have given him if only she'd known. Realising too late just how much Lenny meant to her sent Kelly into a very, very dark place, and she was eventually diagnosed as bipolar herself. However, Kelly eventually managed to reconcile her feelings for her father after he died, and is now proud of the fact that Lenny did the best that he could when raising her and Jamie. It's heartening to see that, despite his reputation, Lenny managed to suppress his own demons a little and make the best of life, even if fate fucked him over immediately afterwards. But, while he may be gone, his story lives on to inspire others that were dealt a similar hand. The sheer difference between Lenny's real self and his literally larger-than-life persona has led to his story being told in a number of biographies, documentaries, biopics, you name it, with some even coming from the perspective of his own kids. Even while Lenny was alive, Hollywood wanted to get in on his story, with actors like Ray Winston expressing interest in the role. Lenny himself wanted Craig Fairbrass to play him, but he ended up shooting down the idea of a biopic entirely because Hollywood wanted to use Sylvester Stallone. Probably for the best that idea get canned. Because there is only one Lenny McLean. As his son Jamie put it, you don't get Guvnors like my dad anymore. He was the last of a dying breed. These days, kids are so trivial. You can have a gun pulled on you in a club just for looking at someone, or for being in the wrong postcode. And then, everything's on camera anyway. It's all changed, and had started to, even by the time he died. While Lenny undoubtedly got up to some crazy shit that has Hollywood written all over it, at the end of the day, the most important aspect of Lenny's story is the deeply human battle between him and his own demons. Sure, it wasn't quite rags to riches, and Lenny didn't manage to beat them all in the time that he had, but he did manage to turn his life around and turn his pain into something positive. He put up one hell of a fight both physically and spiritually, and survived all of the shit that life threw at him long enough to find his true calling. And I think that's a victory in itself. After all, not everyone gets to essentially play themselves in a Guy Ritchie movie. I don't think you can ask for more than that.
It's Count Dankula on YouTube. Everybody just subscribe.